Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary friends. Welcome to another edition of Multicultural Insights, bringing you in-depth discussions with talent, creatives, and industry leaders from entertainment, media, and advertising. I'm Juan Ayala, Director of Content Management here at MediaVillage.org, and your host. In honor of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we are joined by a delightful panel of industry leaders as we learn from their career journeys, gain their perspectives, and discuss the state of diversity and inclusion in the industry today. This episode is brought to you by the 4As, and we thank them very much for their support. Joining us for today's discussion, Kathy Butler, EVP of Talent, Equity, and Learning Solutions at the 4As, Shreya Kushari, Chief Client Officer at OMD, Atish Shah, Chief Creative Officer at Digitas, Ronald Ung, Chief Creative Officer at MRM, and Michelle Tang, Chief Growth Officer at McCann. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. And let's dive right in. I love to start all of these roundtable discussions with this question. So I'm curious if there was a particular performance, a film or project, or a key figure that made you feel seen and represented for that first time growing up, that one that has always remained with you as really impactful. Or was there something like that that came later in life if there was a lack of representation growing up? So Kathy, let's start with you.
I'm going to bookend it with two movies, and I'll preface it by saying I'm not a movie watcher, so this is quite significant that I'm saying these things at all. But the first movie is The Joy Luck Club. Growing up, seeing Asians on the big screen felt also like quite normal. I grew up in Monterey Park, California, and so I was surrounded by Asians, but reflectively looking back, it was actually quite unusual and very, very significant. And then fast forward to present time with now a teenage daughter, my daughter watching Crazy Rich Asians, also just as significant growing up in northern New Jersey, where there are not a lot of Asian folks. So I'm excited that there's representation and continues to grow in that way. But those were definitely significant cultural moments for me.
And Ronald, what about you? What comes to mind?
Yeah, I grew up watching movies from Hong Kong, so very well represented there. But from an international level, to be serious, Joy Luck Club also, and most recently, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I cannot relate to Crazy Rich Asians because I'm not one, but as for Everything Everywhere All at Once, to me, it resonated personally because um, the the I just forgot her name. Oh my God, Michelle Yeoh, is Malaysian, and her winning the Oscar was phenomenal. And it was something that I never could have ever imagined when I was growing up.
And Ati, what about you?
Yeah, I recently so it's going way back because I grew up while I've been in New York for a long time, I grew up actually in northeastern Pennsylvania. So it was kind of devoid of, I think assimilation was the name of the game for my first generation immigrant parents. And so it was kind of just a part of kind of blending into the scenery. But when I grew up, very early days, I have fond memories of my grandmother and some of my extended uncles and aunts playing like Amitabh Bachchan movies, like Bollywood movies, in this like really small one bedroom apartment in Manhattan. And we would all just kind of crowd around. And I didn't follow a word of it, but the themes of revenge and jealousy and ultimate triumph. I remember how palpable the sense of energy was in the room around those movies. And how much there was a great sense of pride about having these film stars amongst family members that, seemingly transcended. And even in college, I'd run into Russian friends of mine who'd be like, we used to watch Bollywood movies. And so even though my connection to it was kind of an ambient signal that didn't even totally decode because I didn't speak the language, it was kind of like this beacon of some mode of heritage where East meets West and stardom is possible. That kind of stuck with me. But I recently read antiquated, but still like in a profound book, Passage to India, E.M. Forster, which is a very psychedelic book, actually, if you get into it. It centers around the happenings in a cave and whether what in your mind's eye happened. But it has you consider cultural collision, the good and the bad, in a way that still has threads in the now. So yeah, so it's I have it's an interesting back and forth with culture because I was never first generation immigrant parents who were very eager for me to figure it out and assimilate. And so it's like a radio signal that's all left of the dial that has me cued into culture. And so every once in a while it turns on again.
And Michelle, what about you?
Mine is very similar to Kathy, I think. I mean, I didn't grow up in Monterey Park. I grew up on the East Coast version of it in Flushing, Queens, which was very much an Asian influenced neighborhood. So my schools were always majority Asian. And I think Joy Luck Club was the first time from a Western perspective to see not just yourself on screen, but to see the cultural nuances that lived in those stories. So for me, that was a really big sort of memorable point. And I go back to that film, actually. It's funny because Joy Luck Club and Crazy Rich Asians are my two on the plane movies whenever I'm traveling. And they're always like that, like, let me just bring myself back. I will say, I think what's been interesting of late is Crazy Rich Asians really opened the door for Asian-led films to have a new place on stage, which has been absolutely phenomenal to watch. So from Everything Everywhere All at Once to Beef doing really well this year in the awards season, that rise in seeing ourselves in film, in pop culture has become really fascinating, especially as my kids are now growing up and being immersed in those environments, whereas we had one film for 30 years.
And Shreya, as you grew up in India, you were surrounded, similarly to other people's experiences, who,
Yes.
were in either neighborhoods or cities surrounded by folks who look like you. But was there sort of another particular performance that maybe you felt told your coming of age story, since you were you saw that representation all the time?
It's interesting, the coming of age piece. Growing up in India, India is known for, as Ati said, it's Bollywood movies, and it's a huge part of us. It's almost subliminal, and we don't even think about it. And so, because our parents pushed us always to be different, were kept away from those movies. Those were for the masses. And, and instead, we watched a lot of Kurosawa, a lot of foreign films, a lot of French movies, and kind of were focused on the globalization and assimilation. It's interesting, Ati, to hear you say the word assimilation in the US. For us, it was sitting in India, assimilating into a global network and not harping on about the past or thinking about just where your roots are, but looking forward. But now, as I've come to a different country, I've established myself here. I'm middle-aged. I have children who are thinking about their future. It's interesting how much more I go back to my roots. I reread our scriptures. I look at movies that were made from a different era, from a genre that I was never exposed to while growing up. A lot of Satyajit Ray, who I believe is inspired by Kurosawa as well. So it's just as life has evolved, as my roots have changed, as I have grown branches, the question of identity and culture has evolved from global to where are my roots, and then making sure that my children are assimilated into whichever society they choose to grow into.
As we've discussed many times regarding the Hispanic and Latin market, the AAPI community, very similarly, is often treated as a monolith by marketers and advertisers. That word comes up a lot when we're discussing representation and things like that, because they have this, or not everyone, but many have this sort of one size fits all approach that they think will reach this entire very diverse, multicultural segment, multilingual. There is no one size fits all, but it's sadly still used very often. So I'm curious, how can that be remedied so that it doesn't feel so much like an afterthought or like too broad of an approach, and that so you can get this thoughtful, positive, and authentic representation in advertising? Ronald, we can start with you for this one.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, right? I mean, there is a reason for sort of, grouping, because, there are so many communities and there are so many unique cultures. But it is, on the flip side, super important for us to recognize and celebrate the differences. Even I'm from Asia, even within the small Southeast Asian region, I'm often mistaken for Singaporean because of the way I speak. And we're very, very different, though similar nations. Definitely very different from the other neighbor, Thailand. So, it's extremely important to not just recognize the different, backgrounds in terms of like regions and, countries, but also the cultures, right? Even within a smaller region.
And Michelle, what about you?
I mean, I think, yes, we are definitely not a monolith, but I do think there are cultural values that sort of transcend the entire region. So there are some similarities, and I think those of us who live within this large cohort and very diverse cohort of cultural backgrounds sort of can see those similarities across the board. So it's interesting. I actually wrote an op-ed just the other day with Ad Age about it, right? There are things that sort of are undercurrents. So things like the idea of duty and obligation, of putting the community and family first, of looking at things with an endurance and a long-term view. I think those things all transcend. So when there are stories that sort of live off of those values that can sort of travel across the region, I think we all see a bit of ourselves in it, right? And I think the other thing I would say is we are only 6% of the American population right now. So for a long time, actually, the reason our community has been so disparate to some degree is because we didn't see those commonalities and we didn't come together. So my personal belief is, for at least right now in this moment of time, this diaspora has to come together, because without each other, our voice just simply isn't as strong.
And Treya, what about you?
I agree. We are not a monolith, but there is a red thread that connects us all. And I would almost go on to say that there's a red thread that connects us all, irrespective of the continent that we or our ancestors came from. And that has a lot to do with the exposures in this world that we have, a sort of value system of hard work, triumphs it all, that just shines through. I mean, Juan, you're a Native American Hispanic, but I think you can also relate to it. So there is almost this traditional culture that kind of has these very simplistic morals that we have been raised on, and I can see why people think of it as a monolith. But there's a uniqueness to it, just hearing how we grew up, right? East Coast, West Coast, Malaysia, Pennsylvania, India. So if we can recognize the red thread, but also in moments appreciate the uniqueness, I think that will be a good representation of what we are.
And Ati, what about you?
Yeah, I think this is well covered by this crew. I think that I personally identify with the other and immigrants, sensibility. I feel like, so to Shreya's point, that's a multi-continent, multi-story, multi-dwelling kind of situation. I think a lot of us inhabit, and I think that those values of leaning into the community, of shared identity and shared progress, and those things, I think very much resonate with me. But I think both things are true, right? I think that there is both the thread that's been discussed, but I think that the fracturing of a monolithic perception comes through getting to know each of us on a first name basis, because we bring a whole, kaleidoscope and homemade soup of our own, inspiration, our own output, our own ticks, lovable and hateable. And I think that those things start to fracture a sense of projection. So I think it's about more of us, more of this community, more of all communities who might feel underrepresented, finding ways to transcend. You're talking about behind the camera, in front of the camera, figuratively. What's a way, without being untrue to yourself, for more of us to be in front of that camera, so that we're seen as whole beings, seen with our eccentricity, seen with our unique passions and threads. I think that starts to change the prism, so it's both of those things. Yeah.
While diversity and inclusion have been on the rise in the last decade, in the last year, we have seen it come under attack. It's been really, really unfortunate, especially with everything that we try to do at MediaVillage in regards to educating the industry and educating folks about the importance of it. We've seen funding cut from DEI departments, if not dissolving them entirely. Certain states are making those initiatives illegal altogether. So how can diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging benefit our industry, and what needs to change in order for that to continue, in order for that growth and that inclusion to continue? And I'll open up the floor for this one, so whoever'd like to chime in first.
I mean, I think it starts with the people we enlist to reflect the sense of perspective, and it's always a plight, but it's a worthy one. I think it's like, the more people though we bring into the industry, from young to senior ranks that can reflect more of this shared worldview, the more I think it, comes into light. I want to be additive because I feel like we have a lot of shared opinions about this, but I think one aspect to it is always the, and it's not an easy one. I gotta say that, from this particular community, sweeping generalization, but a lot of us, when you think about the ad industry, we're not even raised with this as a career option. I think I can safely say. I think it was like not in my Indian first generation's parents' top 5, top 10, top 20. I don't even think they knew what I actually do now. So it's kind of like, it's surgical and it's meditative, and you have to really lean in to figure it out. And it ain't always easy, but it's a worthy mission. But I think talent and recruitment is a big part of it.
So let me be a little controversial on this one. DE&I as a separate team versus DE&I just innately built into the system, right? It is the question at the core of this, and that's the push. And when I think of it, yes, I do not want anyone to think that I got to my career because of the way I look or where my ancestors are from, right? And there was nothing that was pushing me along. Oh, because she's an Indian woman, let's give her this job. It was. Let me be clear, it was never like that. It was almost like an uphill battle, almost. So I do cringe a bit when there's a separate DE&I initiative pushing people, and I believe that meritocracy should rise to the top. So that is my one thing that I will say. However, as we get to the top, alliances, friendships, mentorship can come from any place. It does not have to be DE&I. And if those foundations are built in, I feel that we will represent the country that we serve in.
Yeah.
And that's my perspective on whether there should be a separate lane or not.
I mean, just to jump in, I totally agree with Shreya. I think the ultimate goal is for there to not have a need, for a DE&I initiative, right? That this becomes oxygen, right? Yes. But I'm not a data person, but the power is in the data, right? If there are 7 million represented in the community or in the country, and if it's the largest growing community, why should there be a separate conversation about can we include 20 million people? That's not having to include, that's a lot of people. And if we as an industry ignore and don't have representation in this industry, what society is, then I think we're doing ourselves a disservice, and it's a bit of a shame for the industry that we're trying to build. Yeah.
I agree and I disagree. I think where we are today, we need to have a focus on it. We need leaders to be held accountable to DE&I, right? To make sure that not just in the junior ranks, because I think that's the part that's a little bit easier to some degree, because the generation that's coming into the workforce is by default very, very diverse. But I think Ronald's right in that, like, the ultimate goal is to not need a D&I department. It is to not have the that all the leaders kind of think this broad way. And I don't think we're quite there yet, which is why in my head I feel like we need it, because if you're not reminded of it constantly, it gets kind of very quickly deprioritized with everything else we're dealing with in the business, right? Especially in our business, we're all so under pressure. Like, I feel very much like I'm often the one in the room to be like, well, did we think about this? Well, did we do that? And I take that on myself, not, and I would say this for our community, not everyone in our community does that. Because to T's point, we've been taught assimilation from a very, very young age. But that said, I'm like, one day, hopefully for my children's generation, there is no need for that, because by default, the leaders will be diverse. But until then, we've got a lot of work to do. So we need people that are going to hold organizations accountable to keep moving us forward.
I mean, just to be clear, sorry, I just want to clarify that, I'm not saying that there is no need now. There definitely is a need, especially in our industry, which is not your stereotypical industry for people of our community, right? It's obviously you're going to business, going to tech. But yeah, the hope is that sometime in the future, this becomes, normal.
I think we're also like at a cusp where I'm hoping, at least in our industry, which is a fairly progressive one as a whole, at the epicenter of comms and things like that. I think I'd like to believe we're a little bit more world aware, but even then, I still think there's a need. I will say, though, that there seems to be a shift on that continuum from a kind of insular meditation around D&I, around who are we and what is our makeup, to hopefully a more active practice of the way we project and make, So for instance, at Digitas, a good friend of a lot of folks on this call is a woman by the name of Denisha Lomax. And she's leading a practice where she's building programs, media and otherwise, that are engineered for inclusion. So it's an active practice of like this. And it's like when we work with TikTok creators, how are we equalizing, the playing field in that regard, for instance? And so I feel like that precision and vision for how we are projecting and how media is projecting, I think is a very useful next step. Beyond I think what maybe a few years ago, it was a lot of self-reflection, which is still valid and good, but it has to be more than this kind of a 101. I think I'm hoping we're graduating towards how is that mindset engineered for outcomes, and how and towards the things we craft and the way we organize and orchestrate things.
Yeah, I want to build on that. I mean, I think it's a topic that has a lot of negative headlines to it, but when you think reflectively on the last couple of years, there's been a lot of great work that has been done, and there's a lot of great progress around the efforts for DE&I integration as opposed to it being standalone. So that in and of itself deserves the recognition. I think what's important to think about this and, the headlines of are we there yet? Or why haven't we gotten done, et cetera, is I think just it's misleading because, the human experience is, I hope, never going to be done, and that we're always going to be championing what's right. And I always ask the question of 50 years ago, did we ask why isn't brand planning done yet? I mean, you think about the capabilities within our industry continues to evolve. There's a lot of space for innovation and creativity to do better, to use technology, to use data in a way to advance the practice of the work that we're in. So why can't we have that conversation around the human experience? And why can't we say, well, if brand planning can evolve to experience strategy, I'll just use that as a terrible example, why can't we give more space and time and budget to evolve the practices by which we support the employee experience in our companies?
So you're all in roles that are typically not, you don't usually see AAPI leaders in these particular roles. So I'm curious if there have been any cultural, professional barriers or biases that you've faced in terms of your leadership style, and how have you overcome those situations?
I would love to start this conversation since this is a big reason why I brought you all together. Having been a CEO 2 times in my career, there have been always challenges and expectations of the way that I lead modeled against, sort of what I would say traditional leadership. I'm an introvert. I'm a quiet leader. I'm more hands-on than necessarily kind of shouting at the rooftops. And I had to create space for my leadership to stand out through impact than necessarily me standing on a table and saying, hey, I'm doing this. And that took some training and that took some, I think, not asking for permission, but just demonstrating that this was the way I was going to lead my companies and it was going to result in good things for all the powers that be. And that took some time, despite other conversations of, well, maybe you would consider this or maybe you would consider that. And I think the whole idea of non-traditional leadership, but still being quite effective, is a conversation to be had. We are all leaders in our own way. We all have had impact. We're all doing things for the industry in ways that stand out through results. Yet at the same time, there are not more of us in CEO roles. And in fact, you can make the argument that there are fewer in C-suite roles in general. And so there has to be some space and recognition that leadership comes in many different forms, and it should be respected equally when the results are there.
I completely agree, Kathy. I was like, I have so much to say on this particular topic, and then I was like, if I start, I won't finish. I'll just add a couple points. I think, like, even in where I am currently, this is, I don't know, my third or fourth C-level role within an agency, right? And every time I walk into a room, it takes time for others to settle in, to recognize that I'm not there to take notes. I still get called kiddo all the time just by virtue of looking younger than I am. So it takes this mental shift. And I think I got there personally kind of coming out of a situation where it was like, I didn't want to operate in someone else's ecosystem anymore and had enough self-belief in myself to stand up and be like, you know what, I'm going to do this the way that I do it. And if it doesn't work, then I can be somewhere else and do it. And that's fine. And I think we are also raised, especially when you're, first generation immigrant, a child of a first generation immigrant, you're taught this like scarcity, like, oh, don't rock the boat, don't do a thing, don't like whatever. And then like, it takes such time to get comfortable with like, you know what, if they don't appreciate what I bring to the table, someone else will, and it's gonna all be fine. And it took so many years for me to finally get there. And what I found is once I got comfortable with it, others did as well.
I can talk to, as a creative leader in industry. I've had some great mentors, by the way, on this call. Ronald was my boss at Digitas for a good amount of time. And I've shared the road with all of this crew. I'll say that there are archetypes in the world of creativity that are generational. So like when you think about a creative leader, if I would have said creative leader 5 years ago, even maybe more recent than that, there is an archetype around a kind of lone wolf style of creative, a cult of personality, if you will, someone who just projects an attitudinal sense with, a great, yes, yes, no, no kind of decisioning as things go up on a board, for instance. yeah, there's a deep appreciation almost for this kind of the lone wolf outlaw projection in creativity, at least when I was growing up and going through rank, and trying to race. And so there is a tension, as someone who, by disposition, by the way I grew up, is eager to like bounce ideas with a bigger group of people to build, and to kind of get inspired by something, be like, hey, I can take that and build on that. And then, that particular style at a particular cusp of your career before you get into the C-suite, can be seen as a vulnerability, as if I was always choosy and I always had a point of view, but the idea that like, I wanted to come to that decision through a kind of cultivation with others wasn't the typical archetype, wasn't the archetype that was celebrated in industry, if you will. I'll say that I'd like to believe, that now older, a bit wiser, and a bit further along, I will say that some of the traits that were at that time potentially a gap in the way I projected, I think are quite useful now. I feel like that ambassadorial quality, the willingness to connect and have an ear for the input of other disciplines and other practice leads and other points of view, and that shape that with what I think is a good deal of EQ in addition to the IQ. I think is like I'm starting to see as a noble skill, especially as we all come out of the pandemic. I don't want to call myself noble, but I'm saying that attribute is a noble attribute for those to aspire to when we think about leadership, in the sense of leading with that empathy and that collaborative ear, because especially post-pandemic, I think we're dealing with new generations of creatives, of workforce, of agency, where you can't be a lone wolf if we're going to take this industry any further. I think it's so there's a long way of getting at what for a moment in my career might have been a moment of fission or reflection. I actually think is a good protein as we move forward.
That was very noble, Ati.
I don't mean to say noble. I meant to talk about the quality, not myself, but it's 9 a.m., whatever it is.
I mean, this is a very interesting question, and I, often ask myself this: is it about me coming from a culture, or is it also a different time? Right? I grew up in this industry in Malaysia where the culture was really tough. I had bosses who just told me in my face I was kind of shit, right? But it also helped me grow a really thick skin, right? But as I went beyond the shores of Malaysia, working at the global level, based here, I also asked myself, like, how do I find that balance of like being tough, but being inclusive, right? I have a sort of a thing I tell myself a style which I call bullish, not bully. I think you can find the balance of like being really like intentional and ambitious without being that bully, right? So what Ati said about, being more inclusive, from not just keeping it as a creative exclusive when it comes to ideas, to being creating a culture of team sport really helps, right? So yeah, I think we've all had to evolve, and for very good reason. Nobody wants to. There are a few things that I learned from the bosses that I used to work for, right? These are the kind of bosses I want to work for one day and be one day, and these are the kind of bosses I don't want to work for and be one day. So, I'm sure we've all had those experiences, and I hope,
we continue to have them, Ronald.
Less bully, more bullish is fine.
I mean, all of you have worked with me. My Achilles heel is, quote unquote, being said, "Oh, Shreya, she's very direct," and that in itself is an Achilles heel, but I also make it my strength, because I know how to land a plane, and I will land the plane, and all the passengers will be safe. And that is how I built my path, because in my business of media, there is so much talk, there is so much, staring at the apple and thinking of the shape of the cloud, that, the plane can never go through the cloud and land. So you kind of have to take all that feedback that you get and convert it into actual business dollars and growth for the teams. And that's what I did. And I think that's what all of us have done, and found a way in our leadership style.
So as we've observed that underrepresented talent who have workplace sponsors and mentors often can be led to increased opportunities, and to navigate in corporate America. So what's your take on sponsorship, and what advice would you give to some of those young professionals and individuals who are looking for that sponsorship, that mentorship from someone who was where they were a decade ago or even longer? Shreya, let's start with you for this one.
I mean, we are all quoting Ati on this, so I will quote him. We are not lone wolves, right? Even though it is a highly competitive industry and there's only one CEO at the top, the holdco setup will tell you that there are actually many CEOs. and we can all get there one way or the other. So sponsorship, friendship, mentorship, they're critical. I look back at my own career, and I mean, I'm an immigrant who came here. The only person she knew was her husband. And, today I know people in the industry. How did that happen? Through conversations, helping people helping me, sticking their neck out for me when I was, oh so direct. So I think it can be done, but it doesn't have to be this heavily orchestrated program necessarily. There is an organic element to it as well, and it's an art that can be developed. But to the point, can it be done through a specific organization? Ati, you mentioned how Digitas has an organized system. All our holdcos have it, right? Like, we are looking at various ways to create safe spaces for people. So it is important. It should be done. We would not be where we are if we didn't have that. I would say, given our generation, it was probably more organic rather than a structured process.
For this, when we think about the next gen and the sponsorship piece, I think one thing maybe uniquely cultural resident, even though there's a wide swath we're talking here, is taking the leap, meaning I think that first network synapse is on us to make. And I feel like we don't have legions in this industry. Luckily, we're starting to grow legions, but I don't think there's a coalition or network that's just going to motor you upwards. I feel like, I think there's still that moment when you're on the high dive and you have to ask the big question in the room, or challenge a point of view, or cold call, figuratively, somebody you look up to and be like, I'd love for some advice. I can say personally, when I've had that reach out, from someone, no matter how, and I'm sure everyone here has had that appreciative mentee who made the first connection. You didn't reach out to them and they came to you, and I guarantee that this crew accepted, and I think that's an important part, though. I think it applies to a lot of people, but I think there is a cultural thing, like a wide swath embedded thing around being brave enough to take a leap like that, and to raising your hand in that kind of capacity. And so I just feel like it's a mechanic that has to be present to unlock a larger door. As just reflecting on, did I reach out? Did I ask my question? Did I speak in that room for a second? I think taking that initial action move to be heard and seen is important.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think from an individual perspective, having the intentionality about what you want and making those connections, speaking up, asking for the coffee, asking for advice is so important. So often I'm asked for a coffee where person on the other end, with the best intention, actually has no agenda. And it's just a chat. And I find it a little bit bizarre, because I really want to help, but you need to tell me how you would like me to help. And so My advice for person on the other end is to say, yes, absolutely do it. We will always accept the call, but be clear about what you want to get out of the conversation, out of the relationship, out of the ask, so that we can be intentional with you and help support you in what it is that you want.
And Ronald, as Ati said earlier, you were his boss for some time, and he's totally sees you as a mentor. So I'm curious to get your perspective um, as someone who has been a mentor. What advice do you have for any young professionals coming in?
Yeah. Ati, I just zelled you $50 for saying that.
Thanks. It all worked out then.
But I think, I mean, seriously, I think it's important that people know
He
that
actually checked his phone to see if the Zelle amount had come through.
it's
I'm a little
important
more tasteful than that.
for our teams to know that, we've got their back. But I think as leaders, we have to be more intentional and to offer because, sometimes it's difficult or challenging for them to say, hey, can I go grab a coffee with you? And it's, when we offer these sort of moments like, hey, is everything okay? And it's the small things, right? Not sort of the once a year, hey, let's get together and like make you feel important moments. It's really the small things like, hey, what are you doing? Right? Let's just chat for 10 minutes, unplanned. I think those things are very important. I love the word intentionality, right? They're casual, but they're intentional. So, yeah, that's one thing I'll say about us as leaders, for us to be a bit more intentional and be more conscious about doing those things.
And Michelle, wrap us out. What are your words of wisdom for the next gen?
I mean, I think I agree with everything everyone said in terms of like, yes, continue to reach out, etc. I think as leaders, we also have to be intentional on how we allow folks to engage, right? So for example, like I will always do things when I can, like Ronnie Chang's playing at Radio City. I'm going to buy 2 tickets and give it to the API ERG and say, hey, whoever can go, here you go. Like, and that generosity of like trying to pull up from where I sit, I think has opened so many conversations and I learned so much in these conversations. Like if they think they're getting something out of it, I get so much out of connecting with them because I get to meet the next generation of leaders for our industry and get to learn from them, right? So I think that's one thing. I think the second is a lot of, I think, Asian leaders in particular, our community is sort of quiet around each other. So it's like having a group like this, like many of the groups that are starting to build right now, like having people who will say your name in rooms, who will champion others who look like us, like that's so important. So it's something I try to do when I get a chance to, and I know everyone else on this call for sure, having worked with many of you, do the same. And like, how do you bring the benefits of where this incredible diverse heritage that we've got, how do you bring that to the forefront and call it out and say it as it is? It just elevates the entire community.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today for this discussion, and a huge thank you to the Forays for the support in this episode of Multicultural Insights. Everyone who is listening and watching, please visit MediaVillage.com for more content just like this, more podcasts, industry insights, and thought leadership, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for all of our video content. From MediaVillage.org, I'm Juan Ayala. Thanks for joining us.